The Oregon Trail stretched endlessly before the wagon train like a brown scar across the prairie, dust clouds rising with each labored step of the oxen. 8-year-old Sarah Mitchell pressed her small face against the canvas cover, watching the monotonous landscape roll by. The late summer heat of 1847 pressed down mercilessly, and the smell of unwashed bodies, livestock, and leather filled her nostrils. "Mama, when will we reach Oregon?" Sarah asked, turning to her mother who lay curled beneath a threadbare quilt, despite the sweltering temperature. Elizabeth Mitchell's face was gaunt and pale, her once bright blue eyes now dulled with fever. Dark circles shadowed her cheeks and her breathing came in shallow, labored gasps. "Soon, my darling," she whispered, forcing a weak smile. "Papa's waiting for us there. He'll have built us a beautiful house with a garden, just like he promised." Sarah nodded, though she noticed how her mother's hand trembled as she reached out to stroke her daughter's auburn hair. For 3 days now, Elizabeth had been growing weaker, the fever consuming her strength with each passing mile. The other families in their small wagon train had kept their distance since the sickness began, fear of contagion overriding compassion. As evening approached, their wagon driver, old Henrik Larson, called for the night's halt near a creek bed. The 6 remaining wagons formed their familiar circle, and cooking fires began to flicker to life. Sarah helped her mother sit up, offering her sips of water from their dwindling supply. "Tell me about Papa again," Sarah said, settling beside her mother on the hard wooden floor of the wagon. Elizabeth's eyes grew distant. "Your father is the strongest, kindest man I've ever known. When we reach Oregon, he'll teach you to read, properly, and we'll have chickens in the yard. You'll have your own bed with real sheets, not these old blankets." But as the night deepened, Elizabeth's condition worsened. Her fever spiked, and she began speaking incoherently about people and places from her childhood in Pennsylvania. Sarah held her mother's burning hand, whispering prayers she'd learned in their little church back home. "Sarah," her mother gasped suddenly, gripping her daughter's hand with surprising strength. "Listen to me carefully. If something happens, to me you find your father, Thomas Mitchell, in Willamette Valley. Remember that name. Promise me." "Nothing's going to happen, Mama," Sarah said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You're going to get better." But deep in her heart, she knew her mother was dying. By dawn, Elizabeth Mitchell had drawn her last breath. Sarah sat beside the still body, too shocked and frightened to cry anymore. When Henrik Larson discovered them that morning, his weathered face crumpled with sympathy. "I'm sorry, child," he said gently. We'll need to lay her to rest here." The other families gathered reluctantly around the hastily dug grave. Reverend Walsh from the Johnson wagon spoke a few words over the mound of earth, but Sarah could see the impatience in everyone's faces. They wanted to move on, to leave this place of death behind. "What about the girl?" Mrs. Peterson whispered to her husband, loud enough for Sarah to hear. "We can't take on another mouth to feed," Mr. Peterson replied curtly. "Our own children need our resources." One by one, the families made their excuses. The Johnsons were already struggling with their sick infant. The Andersons had elderly grandparents who required constant care. The Petersons claimed they simply didn't have room. Henrik Larson, his conscience clearly troubled, knelt beside Sarah. "Child, I wish I could take you, but I'm just the hired driver. I don't have the means to care for you properly. Maybe, when we reach the next trading post, we can find someone." But they all knew the truth. Sarah was now an orphan on the frontier, and survival out here was a luxury few could afford to share. As the wagons pulled away, leaving Sarah standing alone beside her mother's grave, the vast emptiness of the plains seemed to swallow her whole. The wind carried the sound of creaking wheels and lowing cattle until even that faded to nothing, leaving only the whisper of grass and her own rapid breathing. She was completely alone. For 2 days, Sarah survived on the meager supplies the wagon train had left her, a small pouch of hardtack, a water skin that was already half empty, and her mother's worn wool cloak. She stayed close to her mother's grave, too frightened to venture far into the endless prairie that stretched in every direction. The nights were the worst. Without the protection of the wagon, every sound seemed amplified and threatening. Coyotes howled in the distance, and once she heard the distinctive snuffling of what she was certain was a bear. She huddled beneath her mother's cloak, pressing herself against the small wooden cross Henrik had hastily constructed. On the morning of the third day, weak from hunger and dehydration, Sarah noticed a figure approaching on horseback from the north. Terror seized her. She'd heard countless stories about hostile Indians from the adult conversations around wagon train campfires. Her first instinct was to run, but her legs felt too weak to carry her far. The rider was clearly Lakota, his long, black hair adorned with eagle feathers, his chest bare except for a bone breastplate, and his face painted with ceremonial markings. He rode a magnificent paint horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle. As he drew closer, Sarah could see he was young, perhaps 25, with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. The brave, whose name was Lakota, meaning red cloud in the Lakota language, had been hunting when he spotted the small figure beside the grave. His people, the Oglala Lakota, considered this area part of their traditional territory, and the presence of a lone child intrigued and concerned him. He dismounted slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. Sarah pressed herself against the wooden cross, her green eyes wide with terror. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered in English, though she knew he likely wouldn't understand. Lakota approached the grave and examined the fresh earth, then looked at the child's condition, her hollow cheeks, the way her dress hung loose, on her thin frame the dehydration evident in her cracked lips. His expression softened with understanding and something deeper, respect for the sacred nature of death and the vulnerability of the orphaned. In his worldview, children were gifts from Wakantanka, the Great Spirit, and to find one abandoned beside a grave was a sign that demanded action. The Lakota had a strong tradition of adoption, often taking in children from other tribes or even captive enemies, raising them as their own. He spoke softly in Lakota, his voice gentle despite the language barrier. "Winona Sistina," he said, calling her little daughter in his tongue. From his parfleche bag, he withdrew a piece of dried buffalo meat and offered it to her. Sarah's hunger overcame her fear. She reached out tentatively and took the food, tearing into it with desperate gratitude. The taste was strange, salty and smoky, but it was sustenance. Lakota studied the grave marker and the meager possessions scattered around the makeshift camp. He could piece together the story. A family traveling west, death on the trail, abandonment. It was a tale he'd witnessed before, the tragic consequence of the Wasiku white people, pushing across lands they didn't understand with inadequate preparation. He made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Kneeling beside Sarah, he placed his hand over his heart and then gestured toward himself. "Lakota," he said slowly, repeating his name several times until she attempted to say it back. "Lakota," Sarah tried, the unfamiliar syllables clumsy on her tongue. He smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen in days, and pointed to her. "Sarah?" he asked, having heard Henrik calling her name from a distance when the wagons departed. She nodded, surprised he knew her name. Standing, Lakota gestured toward his horse and then toward the northern horizon. The meaning was clear. "Come with me." Sarah looked back at her mother's grave, fear and grief warring in her chest. Everything she'd ever known lay in that small mound of earth. But the alternative was certain death alone on the plains. With trembling hands, she gathered her few possessions, her mother's Bible, a small wooden doll her father had carved, and the wool cloak. Lakota helped her onto his horse, settling her in front of him where she'd be secure. As they rode north toward the Lakota encampment, Sarah felt the solid warmth of her rescuer behind her, and for the first time in days, dared to hope she might survive. The prairie that had seemed so hostile and empty now revealed itself differently through Lakota's eyes. He pointed out medicinal plants, identified animal tracks, and showed her how to read the land's subtle signs. Behind them, her mother's grave grew smaller until it disappeared entirely into the vast landscape. But Sarah carried Elizabeth's final words in her heart. Find your father. Remember who you are. Survive. The Lakota camp spread along the banks of the Cheyenne River like a living organism, with nearly 40 teepees arranged in family clusters. Smoke rose from countless fires, and the sounds of daily life, children laughing, women calling to each, other horses nickering, filled the air. For Sarah, stepping into this world felt like entering a vivid dream. Mahpeluta's arrival with the strange white child caused an immediate stir. People emerged from their lodges, curious and cautious. Sarah clung to her few possessions, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells, the tang of wood smoke, the scent of tanned hide, the aroma of cooking meat she couldn't identify. The Brave brought her directly to his grandmother, Winona Wacewen, good woman, who served as one of the camp's respected elders. Despite being nearly 70, her movements were still graceful, and her dark eyes held depths of wisdom accumulated over decades of frontier life. Mahpeluta spoke rapidly in Lakota, gesturing toward Sarah and then toward the southern horizon, where he'd found her. Winona listened intently, occasionally asking sharp questions. Sarah couldn't understand the words, but she could sense the gravity of their discussion. Finally, Winona approached her and knelt down, studying Sarah's face with keen intelligence. She spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "Child, you have no family now?" Sarah shook her head, fresh tears threatening. "My mama died. Papa's in Oregon, but I don't know how to find him. Oregon very far, very dangerous." Winona's weathered hands were surprisingly gentle as she touched Sarah's face. "You stay with us now. Learn our ways. Mahpeluta says spirits brought you to sacred ground. This means something." Over the following weeks, Sarah's integration into Lakota life began slowly and sometimes painfully. Winona took primary responsibility for her care, but the entire extended family participated in her education. She was given a place in Mahpeluta's family teepee, sleeping on soft buffalo robes that were far more comfortable than the hard wagon floor she'd grown accustomed to. The language barrier proved the first major challenge. Children in the camp would point at objects and repeat their Lakota names until Sarah could pronounce them correctly. Minai for water, Wape for leaf, Sunka for dog. Her young mind absorbed the new vocabulary quickly, and within a month she could communicate basic needs and wants. The cultural differences were more complex. Sarah struggled with the communal nature of everything. Food was shared freely, personal. Possessions seemed to belong to everyone, and privacy as she'd known it didn't exist. When she instinctively hoarded a piece of dried fruit in her dress pocket, Winona gently explained the Lakota concept of generosity and how survival depended on everyone sharing resources. "In White World, you think only of yourself, your family," Winona said one evening as they worked together preparing buffalo hide. "Here, we think of all people as family. What helps one helps all." Sarah's greatest challenge came in learning to let go of her rigid Christian upbringing without completely abandoning her mother's memory. When she knelt beside her bedroll to recite the prayers Elizabeth had taught her, some of the other children giggled, but Winona silenced them with a sharp word. "All prayers reach the same sky," the elder woman told Sarah privately. "Your mother's God and our Wakantanka. Same spirit, different names." As autumn painted the plains in brilliant reds and golds, Sarah began to find her place in the community. She learned to help with daily tasks, gathering berries and roots, assisting with hide preparation, tending the cooking fires. Her small, quick fingers proved excellent at intricate beadwork, earning praise from the women. But it was her relationship with Mahpeluta that became the cornerstone of her new life. He proved to be a patient and devoted guardian, teaching her to ride, showing her how to read weather patterns in the clouds, and sharing stories of Lakota history and customs. In the evenings, he would often sit beside the fire and tell her tales of brave warriors and wise elders, helping her understand her new world. "Why did you save me?" Sarah asked one night in her improving Lakota, mixed with English when she lacked the vocabulary. Mahpeluta considered the question seriously. When I saw you there, beside your mother's grave, I saw courage. You did not give up, even when you were alone. The spirit spoke to me. This child has purpose. Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly seen and valued. However, the autumn also brought troubling news. Other bands reported increasing tensions with white settlers and the U.S. Army. Wagon trains were being rerouted, and there were rumors of conflicts escalating along traditional hunting grounds. The world is changing quickly, Winona told Sarah, one crisp morning as they watched Mapeluta and other men prepare for a hunting expedition. Your two peoples, they do not understand each other. This makes danger for everyone. Sarah nodded, though she was beginning to think of the Lakota as her people too. The distinction between white and Indian was becoming less clear in her mind, replaced by more immediate concerns. Family, safety, belonging. But late one night, she overheard Mapeluta and his uncle speaking in urgent hushed tones about soldiers approaching from the east. The word bluecoats needed no translation, and Sarah's stomach clenched with familiar fear. Her two worlds were about to collide. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it challenges that tested both Sarah's resilience and her growing bond with the Lakota community. The first snow fell in October, and the band moved to their winter camp in a protected valley, where tall cottonwoods provided shelter from the harsh winds. Sarah had been with the Lakota for 4 months now, and the transformation was remarkable. Her auburn hair, now braided with beads and feathers in the traditional style, caught the firelight as she worked beside Winona preparing winter stores. Her English was becoming rusty from disuse, while her Lakota flowed more naturally each day. The other children had long since accepted her as one of their own, and she'd proven herself capable and hardworking. But it was her relationship with Mapeluta that had become the anchor of her new life. He'd become the father figure she desperately needed, teaching her not just practical skills but the deeper values of Lakota culture: respect for nature, the importance of generosity, and the interconnectedness of all living things. One evening, in December, as they sat around the fire sharing stories, Mapeluta presented Sarah with a gift that brought tears to her eyes. A beautiful pair of moccasins, intricately beaded with patterns that told the story of her rescue and adoption into the tribe. "These mark you as truly one of us," he said solemnly. "You are no longer the lost child we found. You are Winona Sistina, little daughter of the Oglala Lakota." Sarah traced the beadwork with trembling fingers, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering. This wasn't just footwear. It was identity, belonging, family. But that same night, their peaceful world shattered. A young warrior burst into the camp on a lathered horse, shouting warnings in rapid Lakota. Sarah caught enough words to understand. Soldiers, many of them, approaching from the south. The camp erupted into controlled chaos as families began hastily packing their most essential belongings. Mapeluta found Sarah standing frozen beside the fire, clutching her new moccasins. "We must leave quickly," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "The bluecoats come with many men. They seek to force all Lakota onto reservations." As the band prepared to flee deeper into the Badlands, a terrible realization struck Sarah. Among the approaching soldiers might be men who knew her father, who could help her reach Oregon. After months of healing and finding family among the Lakota, she was suddenly faced with an impossible choice. "Mapeluta," she said, her voice small in the chaos around them. What if they could help me find my papa?" His face went very still. In the firelight, she could see the pain her words caused him, though he tried to hide it. "The soldiers do not come to help," he said quietly. "They come to take our land, our freedom. If they find you here, they will say we stole you. This will bring punishment to all our people." The weight of his words settled on Sarah like a stone. She understood now that her presence put everyone she'd come to love at risk. The very fact that she was white made her a liability in a world where racial tensions were escalating toward war. But as they prepared to ride out, disaster struck. A patrol of 20 cavalry soldiers crested the hill overlooking their valley, moving faster than anyone had anticipated. There was no time to flee. "Everyone stay calm," called out Black Hawk, the band's chief. "We are peaceful. We do not want fight." Captain Morrison of the 7th Cavalry was a hard man with cold gray eyes who'd spent 3 years fighting Indians across the frontier. He saw the Lakota camp and immediately assumed the worst, especially when his scout pointed out the white child standing beside one of the warriors. "By God, they've got a captive," Morrison declared to his sergeant. "Probably taken from some poor family." Before anyone could explain, before Sarah could speak, the soldiers had dismounted and were surrounding the camp with rifles ready. Captain Morrison strode directly toward Sarah, his face set in righteous anger. "Don't worry, child," he said in a voice meant to be reassuring, but that sounded harsh after months of Lakota gentleness. "We're here to rescue you from these savages." "No," Sarah protested, stepping closer to Mapiluta. "They didn't take me. They saved me. My mama died but Morrison wasn't listening. He'd already decided the narrative. Innocent white child captured by hostile Indians, brave soldiers arriving just in time for rescue. It was a story that would play well in newspapers and justify whatever actions he took. "Sergeant Williams, get the child away from them," he ordered. Sarah found herself torn from Mapiluta's side despite her protests. Around her, she could see the Lakota men's hands moving toward their weapons, the women pulling children behind them. The tension was a living thing, crackling in the cold air like lightning about to strike. "Please," she cried to Captain Morrison, switching desperately between English and Lakota. "You don't understand. They're my family now. Mapiluta found me dying and—" "Stockholm Syndrome," Morrison said dismissively to his sergeant. "Common. With captives, they start identifying with their captors." As soldiers began roughly searching the camp and questioning the Lakota, Sarah watched her new world falling apart. Winona was weeping silently, and she could see the devastation in Mapiluta's eyes as he realized he was about to lose the daughter he'd grown to love. In that moment, Sarah understood that belonging isn't just about where you sleep or what language you speak. It's about who would die for you, who celebrates your joys and shares your sorrows, who sees your true self and loves you anyway. The moccasins Mapiluta had given her lay trampled in the snow, their beautiful beadwork scattered like broken dreams. But as Captain Morrison prepared to take her away, Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not let this moment be the end of her story with the Lakota people. She would find a way back to the family that had chosen her when the world had abandoned her. Epilogue: The Long Journey. Home. 3 years later, Sarah Mitchell stood on the platform of the newly completed Union Pacific Station in Omaha, Nebraska. At 11 years old, she'd grown tall and strong, her auburn hair now neatly pinned beneath a proper bonnet, her calico dress perfectly pressed according to the standards of the Methodist orphanage where she'd spent the past 2 years. Captain Morrison had indeed delivered her to authorities in Denver, where she'd been placed in institutional care while attempts were made to locate her father. The search had taken months, complicated by the vastness of Oregon Territory and the incomplete records of westward migration. When they finally found Thomas Mitchell, he was remarried with 2 new children, struggling to establish his farm in the Willamette Valley. The reunion had been awkward and painful. Thomas was a man broken by years of waiting and uncertainty, and Sarah was no longer the 8-year-old daughter he remembered. The Lakota way she'd learned, her different relationship with nature, her communal instincts, her spiritual flexibility, clashed sharply with his rigid Presbyterian worldview. After 6 months of mutual struggle, they'd made the difficult decision that she would be better served in a proper educational institution. The Methodist orphanage in Omaha provided schooling, religious instruction, and preparation for civilized life. But Sarah had never forgotten her true family. Now, clutching a carefully saved train ticket purchased with money earned from seamstress work, she was finally returning to Lakota territory. The railroad had changed everything. What once took months of dangerous travel could now be accomplished in days, but she knew the real journey would begin when she left the train. She'd spent 3 years learning everything she could about the changing political situation. The wars she'd feared as a child had indeed come to pass. The Great Sioux War had raged across the northern plains, culminating in events that had shaken the nation. She'd read newspaper accounts of battles with names that made her heart ache. Little Bighorn, Wounded Knee, the death of Sitting Bull. Most Lakota bands had been forced onto reservations, but Sarah had hope. Through careful research and letters to Indian agents, she'd learned that some of Mapiluta's people had settled on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. It was there she was heading now. As the train carried her west across the prairie she'd once crossed in a wagon, Sarah reflected on the profound lesson her young life had already taught her. Family isn't determined by blood alone, but by love, sacrifice, and choice. The Lakota had chosen her when her own people had abandoned her. Now she was choosing them in return. She fingered the small beaded medallion hidden beneath her dress, a gift from Winona that she'd managed to keep through all her moves and placements. It depicted a white bird flying between earth and sky, caught between two worlds but belonging to both. The train whistle echoed across the plains, a sound that would have been alien and frightening to the Lakota just years before, but was now part of their reality. Change was inevitable, but love endured across all transformations. Sarah closed her eyes and pictured Mapiluta's face as he'd called her Winona Sistina for the first time, the memory as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. She remembered every detail of that moment, the warmth in his dark eyes, the gentle way he'd pronounced the syllables, the sense of finally belonging somewhere in the vast, often cruel world. Tomorrow, if fortune smiled upon her, she would see him again. She would tell him in fluent Lakota how his kindness had shaped every day of her life since, how the values he'd taught her, generosity, respect for all living things, the importance of community, had sustained her through the darkest moments of institutional life. She thought of the nights when homesickness for the Lakota camp had nearly overwhelmed her, when the rigid schedules and cold dormitories of the orphanage felt like a prison. In those moments, she would close her eyes and remember sitting beside the fire as Winona taught her beadwork, or riding across the prairie with Mapiluta as he showed her how to read the language of the wind and clouds. These memories had been her anchor, her reminder that she was more than just another displaced orphan. She was a daughter of two worlds. Most importantly, she would thank him for showing an abandoned 8-year-old that sometimes the most profound families are the ones we choose and who choose us in return, transcending race, culture, and circumstance through the simple revolutionary act of love. He had taught her that family wasn't about sharing the same blood, but about sharing the same heart, the same commitment to each other's well-being and growth. The train rolled on through the gathering dusk, carrying Sarah toward a reunion that would bridge two worlds and prove that the bonds forged in compassion are stronger than the forces that seek to divide us. 2 days later, Sarah stood at the edge of the Pine Ridge Reservation, her heart pounding as she recognized familiar faces among the people going about their daily lives. The reservation was different from the free-roaming camps of her childhood, more confined with government buildings and supervised activities. But the essence of the Lakota people remained unchanged. An elderly woman looked up from her beadwork and gasped. Winona Kistina? It was Winona Wastewin, now frailer but with the same kind eyes, Sarah remembered. Word spread quickly through the settlement, and within minutes, a crowd had gathered. Then, through the group of curious faces, she saw him. Mapiluta was older now, his hair streaked with gray, lines etched around his eyes from years of struggle and loss. But when he saw Sarah, his face transformed with joy and disbelief. "My daughter," he whispered in Lakota, the words carrying 3 years of grief and hope. "You came home." Sarah ran to him, tears streaming down her face as he enveloped her in the embrace she'd dreamed of during countless lonely nights at the orphanage. Around them, the community celebrated the return of their lost daughter. "I never forgot," Sarah said in fluent Lakota, her voice thick with emotion. "I never forgot who I am, or who gave me life when the world had abandoned me." That evening, as the community gathered around the fire to hear Sarah's story and share their own tales of survival, She understood that she had finally found her place in the world, not as someone caught between two cultures, but as someone enriched by both, a bridge between worlds carrying the best of each in her heart. Mapeluta smiled as he watched his adopted daughter laughing with the children, teaching them songs she'd learned in the white world, while they taught her new Lakota words that had emerged during her absence. Love, he reflected, truly was the strongest medicine of all. Her journey home was complete.